March 19, 1945. Dawn was breaking over the Pacific Ocean 50 miles off the coast of Japan. USS Franklin, call sign CV-13, was preparing for another day of combat operations. The Essex-class aircraft carrier was one of the most powerful warships in the world, displacing 27,000 tons and carrying over 90 aircraft. She was part of Task Force 58, the fast carrier task force that was systematically destroying Japanese air power in preparation for the invasion of Okinawa. On Franklin's flight deck, dozens of aircraft were being armed and fueled for the morning strike. Bombs and rockets were being loaded. Aviation gasoline was being pumped into fuel tanks. Ammunition was being fed into machine guns. It was a routine morning on a carrier at war, dangerous work done every day by thousands of sailors across the Pacific. But this morning would be anything but routine. At 7:08, radar operators detected a single Japanese aircraft approaching at high altitude. It was identified as a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber, a fast reconnaissance aircraft that the Japanese sometimes used for kamikaze attacks. Combat air patrol fighters were vectored to intercept. But the Japanese pilot was skilled and lucky. He dove through the clouds, streaking toward Franklin at over 400 miles per hour. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, filling the sky with bursts of flak. But the pilot held his course, diving straight at the carrier's flight deck. The Japanese pilot released two 500-pound semi-armor-piercing bombs from low altitude, then attempted to pull up and escape. One bomb struck the flight deck near the aft elevator. The other hit further forward. Both bombs penetrated the wooden flight deck and detonated inside the ship, in the hangar deck where dozens of fully fueled and armed aircraft were parked wingtip to wingtip. The effect was catastrophic. Within seconds, USS Franklin was transformed from a functioning warship into a vision of hell. Massive fireballs erupted from the hangar deck as aviation fuel ignited. Armed aircraft began exploding in a chain reaction of destruction that tore through the ship. Rockets launched themselves wildly in all directions. Bombs cooked off and detonated. Ammunition for machine guns began firing like fireworks. The carrier shuddered with explosion after explosion as her own weapons destroyed her from the inside. 724 sailors were killed instantly in the initial explosions and fires. The ship's communication systems were destroyed. Her fire mains were ruptured, leaving no water pressure to fight the fires. Her steering was damaged. Power was failing throughout the ship. Franklin began listing to starboard as water flooded into ruptured compartments. Black smoke poured from her hangar deck in a column visible for 50 miles. Every ship in the task force could see Franklin burning and knew what that meant. Carriers didn't survive damage like this. The ship was going to sink. Captain Leslie Garris stood on Franklin's bridge, watching his ship die around him. He had already lost over 700 men. The fires were out of control. The ship was listing and might capsize. Standard procedure in this situation was clear. Order abandon ship, get the surviving crew off before the carrier rolled over or exploded. But Garris hesitated. If there was any chance at all, that Franklin could be saved, he had to try. He made the decision that would determine the fate of his ship and crew. USS Franklin would not be abandoned. They would fight to save her. And if they failed, they would go down with their ship. The two bombs that hit USS Franklin caused damage out of all proportion to their size. They weren't particularly large weapons by the standards of 1945. Each bomb weighed only 500 pounds, and hundreds of similar bombs had hit American ships throughout the Pacific War without causing catastrophic damage. But these bombs hit at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible place. and created a cascade of destruction that nearly destroyed one of the world's largest warships. The timing was catastrophic. Franklin had been preparing for a major strike against Japanese airfields on the mainland. Every aircraft on the hangar deck was fully fueled, fully armed, and ready to launch. Gasoline tanks were topped off with hundreds of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel. Bombs hung from wing racks. Rockets were loaded in launch tubes. Ammunition belts were fed into machine guns. The hangar deck was essentially a massive bomb waiting to explode. All it needed was a spark. The Japanese bombs provided that spark. When the first bomb detonated in the hangar deck, it ruptured fuel tanks on multiple aircraft simultaneously. Aviation gasoline sprayed across the deck and ignited instantly, creating a fireball that engulfed dozens of planes. The intense heat caused ammunition to cook off. Machine gun rounds began firing in all directions, cutting down sailors attempting to fight the fires. Rockets, designed to be stable under normal conditions, but vulnerable to heat, began launching themselves from their racks. Some rocketed across the hangar deck, starting new fires wherever they hit. Others shot through the open hangar deck doors and flew out over the ocean in random directions. The bombs on the aircraft were even more dangerous. These were not training weapons, but live ordnance intended for use against Japanese targets. As the fires intensified, the bombs began to cook off. Small bombs detonated first, adding their explosive force to the growing inferno. Then larger bombs began exploding. Each detonation would cause more aircraft to burn, which would cause more ammunition and rockets to cook off, which would cause more bombs to explode. It was a vicious cycle of destruction that fed on itself and grew worse with each passing second. The explosions were so powerful that they blew aircraft apart and sent flaming debris flying throughout the ship. Pieces of aircraft weighing hundreds of pounds were hurled like shrapnel, punching through bulkheads and starting fires in new compartments. The wooden flight deck, designed to be relatively light to save weight on the ship, offered almost no protection. Explosions below would blow holes in the flight deck, sending burning debris shooting into the sky. Sailors on the deck found themselves dodging falling wreckage, while trying to fight fires and rescue wounded shipmates. The ship's damage control system, normally highly effective, was overwhelmed immediately. The initial explosions killed or incapacitated most of the trained damage control personnel. The officers who would normally coordinate firefighting efforts were dead. The damage control center, which would direct the ship's response to battle damage, was destroyed. The fire mains, the pipes that carried water under pressure throughout the ship for firefighting, were ruptured in dozens of places. Even where fire mains remained intact, there was no pressure because the pumps that supplied them had lost power. Communication throughout the ship had broken down completely. The telephone system was destroyed. The ship's intercom was offline. Officers trying to coordinate the response had no way to talk to each other or to their men. Orders had to be passed by messenger, if messengers could get through the smoke and flames. Many compartments were cut off completely, with sailors trapped inside having no idea what was happening in the rest of the ship or whether they should stay put or attempt to escape. The list to starboard grew worse as water flooded into compartments breached by explosions and by desperate attempts to fight fires. A carrier has relatively high center of gravity because of its massive flight deck and island superstructure. If the list continued to grow, Franklin would reach a point of no return where she would roll over and capsize. Sailors working on the slanted decks found themselves struggling to maintain footing while carrying wounded shipmates or fighting fires. Equipment that wasn't secured began sliding across decks, creating additional hazards. And through it all, the fires continued to burn. Not small fires that could be controlled with handheld extinguishers, but massive conflagrations that turned entire compartments into ovens. Temperatures in the hangar deck reached 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt steel. Paint on metal surfaces burst into flame spontaneously. Sailors trying to approach the fires found their clothing catching fire from radiant heat alone. Some men were simply incinerated, leaving nothing behind but ash and shadows burned into bulkheads. Captain Garres, watching from the bridge, understood that his ship was dying. Franklin was dead in the water, listing, burning out of control, and still exploding as more ordnance cooked off. The cruiser USS Santa Fe had pulled alongside to take off wounded and non-essential personnel. Over 800 sailors had already abandoned ship, evacuated to other vessels in the task force. The crew that remained numbered perhaps 400 men, and almost none of them had formal training in damage control. They were aviation mechanics, cooks, clerks, radiomen, sailors whose jobs had nothing to do with saving a dying ship. But they were all that Franklin had left. If the carrier was going to survive, it would be because these 400 ordinary sailors did the extraordinary. The flight deck of USS Franklin had become a landscape from a nightmare. Holes blown by exploding ordnance gaped in the wooden deck, with flames and smoke pouring through them from the inferno in the hangar deck below. Wreckage of destroyed aircraft lay scattered everywhere, some still burning, some simply twisted metal hulks. Unexploded bombs lay on the deck where they had been blown clear of destroyed aircraft, bombs that could detonate at any moment if heated by the surrounding fires. And everywhere, the bodies of sailors who had been caught in the initial attack. The surviving crew members on the flight deck faced an impossible situation. They had no water pressure for firefighting. They had no heavy equipment to move wreckage or clear debris. They had no protective gear beyond whatever clothing they were wearing. Many had no training for this kind of work, but they had to act, because every minute the fires burned brought Franklin closer to sinking or exploding. So they improvised. Sailors formed bucket brigades, passing buckets of seawater hand to hand from the deck edge to the fires. It was pathetically inadequate against fires of this magnitude, but it was all they had. The men knew the buckets of water weren't going to put out the fires, but they might cool down a hot bomb enough to prevent it from exploding. They might extinguish a small fire before it spread to something more dangerous. Every small success bought a little more time. Other sailors took on the terrifying job of jettisoning live ordnance. Bombs that had been blown clear of destroyed aircraft lay on the deck, some already hot enough to be dangerous. These bombs had to be thrown overboard before they cooked off and caused more explosions. Sailors would approach a bomb, usually in pairs, grab it however they could, and carry or roll it to the deck edge and heave it over the side. They were handling weapons that could explode and kill them at any second. Some bombs were too hot to touch with bare hands, so sailors would kick them or push them with whatever they could find, trying to get them overboard before they detonated. Lieutenant Commander Joseph O'Callaghan, the ship's Catholic chaplain, worked on the flight deck throughout the crisis despite having no formal damage control training. O'Callaghan organized working parties, directed firefighting efforts, and personally helped throw hot bombs overboard. At one point, he realized that a magazine containing bombs and rockets was about to explode. The compartment was already hot and filling with smoke. O'Callaghan led a party down into the magazine and began flooding it with water to cool the ordnance. They worked in near darkness, in choking smoke, in temperatures that were climbing toward the detonation point of the weapons they were trying to save. They flooded the magazine seconds before it would have exploded. That single act probably saved the ship, because the magazine explosion would have broken Franklin's keel and sunk her immediately. On the port side of the flight deck, Lieutenant Commander Gary Shea organized another group of sailors to fight fires and clear wreckage. Shea's men worked for hours without break, dragging wounded shipmates to safety, throwing debris overboard, cooling hot bombs with seawater, and trying to create fire breaks to prevent the fires from spreading. Shea himself was wounded twice by exploding ordnance, but refused evacuation and continued working. His leadership held together a group of exhausted, terrified sailors who were accomplishing things they didn't know they were capable of. The carrier's medical staff was overwhelmed. The sick bay had been destroyed in the initial attack, and most of the medical personnel were casualties. The surviving medics set up aid stations wherever they could find space, treating horrible burns, traumatic amputations, and blast injuries with whatever supplies they could scavenge. Pharmacists mate first class. Robert Blanchard worked continuously for over 12 hours, treating more than 300 wounded sailors despite being wounded himself. He would later receive the Navy Cross for his actions, one of dozens of decorations awarded to Franklin's crew. Throughout the day, the fires would seem to be coming under control, then would flare up again as new ordnance cooked off or as firefighters discovered new blazes in compartments they hadn't been able to reach before. Each explosion would cause the ship to shudder, and sailors would brace themselves, wondering if this was the big one, the explosion that would break the ship's back and send her to the bottom. But Franklin held together, and the men kept fighting. The list to starboard remained a constant worry. If Franklin rolled too far, water would pour into the hangar deck through the open hangar deck doors, and the ship would capsize. Engineers worked frantically to counter flood compartments on the port side, intentionally flooding spaces that were still watertight to balance the weight of water on the starboard side. It was a desperate measure that brought its own risks. Flooding too much would sink the ship just as surely as capsizing would. But the engineers calculated carefully and slowly, agonizingly slowly, Franklin's list began to decrease. She wasn't going to roll over. At least not yet. By late afternoon, some progress was visible. The major fires in the hangar deck, while still burning, were no longer growing. Most of the loose ordnance on the flight deck had been jettisoned. Damage control parties had managed to establish some working fire mains, giving them actual water pressure to fight fires instead of just buckets. The ship was still in terrible condition, still listing, still burning, still at risk of sinking. But she was fighting back. The crew was winning their battle against the fires and floods. USS Franklin might survive after all. The sailors who kept fighting to save USS Franklin after the initial attack were not the men who would normally handle such a crisis. The ship's trained damage control teams were dead or evacuated. The officers who specialized in firefighting and flooding control were gone. The engineering experts who understood the carrier's complex systems were casualties. The 400 sailors who remained were, for the most part, men whose duties had nothing to do with saving a sinking ship. They were there because they chose to be there, because they refused to abandon their ship, because they believed Franklin could be saved. Aviation machinists mate third class. Robert Wassman had been working on aircraft engines when the bombs hit. He survived the initial explosions and could easily have evacuated with the others. Instead, he joined a working party throwing live bombs overboard. For hours, Wassman handled ordnance that could explode at any moment, never hesitating, never considering his own safety. When asked later why he stayed when he could have left, Wassman said simply, "It was my ship. You don't abandon your ship when she needs you." That attitude was repeated across the crew. Sailors whose jobs were completely gone, whose workspaces were destroyed, whose shipmates were dead, stayed anyway and found ways to help. Cooks formed firefighting parties. Clerks helped throw bombs overboard. Radio men carried wounded to aid stations. Nobody asked if this was their job. They saw what needed to be done, and they did it. The ship's executive officer, Commander Joe Taylor, organized the survivors into coordinated working parties despite having no functioning communication system. Taylor would physically move from group to group, assessing what they needed, directing them to new tasks, encouraging them when they were exhausted. He kept track of which compartments were flooded, which fires were controlled, which magazines needed flooding, where wounded sailors were trapped. He did all of this while the ship continued to explode around him, while smoke made visibility almost zero, while the deck tilted beneath his feet. His leadership transformed a disorganized collection of terrified sailors into an effective damage control force. Below decks, engineering crews worked to restore power and propulsion. If Franklin was going to survive, she needed to be able to move under her own power. A dead ship was a target. A ship that couldn't maneuver was vulnerable to submarine attack. The engineers knew this, and they worked miracles. Despite flooded compartments, despite damaged equipment, despite ruptured steam lines that filled spaces with scalding vapor, they managed to get some boilers online. By late afternoon, Franklin had limited propulsion. She could make 3 knots, barely more than walking speed, but she was moving. The crew cheered when they felt the ship's engines rumble to life. Their ship was fighting back. The heavy cruiser USS Pittsburgh came alongside Franklin and passed a towing cable. Pittsburgh began towing the damaged carrier away from the Japanese coast at 5 knots, while Franklin's engineers worked to restore more power. It was a dangerous operation. Both ships were vulnerable while connected by the towing cable, and Japanese submarines were known to be operating in the area. But Pittsburgh's captain didn't hesitate. Franklin needed help, and Pittsburgh would provide it regardless of risk. As night fell on March 19th, USS Franklin was still burning, but no longer in immediate danger of sinking. The major fires were being contained. The list had been corrected. The ship was making headway, first under tow, and then under her own power as more boilers came online. Casualties were still being treated. Bodies of the dead were being collected and prepared for burial. The ship's crew, exhausted beyond anything they had experienced before, continued working because the work wasn't done. Captain Garres sent a message to Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of Task Force 58, reporting Franklin's status. The carrier was badly damaged, but afloat. Casualties were over 800 killed and nearly 500 wounded. The ship could not operate aircraft and would require months of repairs. But she was not going to sink. Mitcher's response was brief. "Well done, Franklin. You've earned your place in naval history." Over the following days, Franklin limped across the Pacific toward Pearl Harbor. The crew continued to fight fires and repair damage. They buried their dead with full military honors, committing their shipmates to the sea with prayers and salutes. They cleaned up wreckage and shored up damaged structure. They transformed their ship from a burning wreck into a battered but functioning vessel. On March 28th, 9 days after the attack, USS Franklin entered Pearl Harbor under her own power. Ships in the harbor sounded their sirens and horns in salute. The carrier that should have sunk had made it home. The welcome at Pearl Harbor was emotional. Other sailors who saw Franklin's damage couldn't believe the ship had survived. Holes in the flight deck were big enough to drive a truck through. The island superstructure was blackened by fire and pockmarked by explosions. The hangar deck looked like a scrapyard, filled with twisted metal and destroyed equipment. But Franklin was afloat, and her crew was proud. They had done the impossible. They had saved their ship when everyone thought she was lost. USS Franklin spent the next several months undergoing repairs at Pearl Harbor and then at the Puget Sound Navy Yard in Washington. The damage was extensive. The flight deck had to be completely rebuilt. The hangar deck required major structural repairs. Thousands of feet of electrical cable had to be replaced. Fire-damaged compartments had to be gutted and reconstructed. The repair work required nearly as much labor as building a new carrier would have taken. But the Navy was determined to save Franklin, both because carriers were valuable and because the ship had become a symbol of American determination and courage. While Franklin underwent repairs, the full story of what had happened on March 19th began to emerge. Investigation boards interviewed survivors, examined damage reports, and pieced together the sequence of events. What they discovered was that USS Franklin had suffered more damage than any other American carrier that survived the war. The casualties, 724 killed and 265 wounded, made Franklin the most expensive carrier loss of the war in terms of lives, even though the ship herself survived. The heroism displayed by Franklin's crew was recognized with an unprecedented number of awards. 2 Medals of Honor were awarded. One to Lieutenant Commander Joseph O'Callaghan, the chaplain who had organized damage control parties and flooded the magazine, and one to Lieutenant Junior Grade Donald Gary, who had led rescue parties into smoke-filled compartments to bring out trapped sailors. O'Callaghan became the first chaplain in naval history to receive the Medal of Honor. 19 Navy crosses were awarded, along with hundreds of other decorations for valor, but the recognition meant less to the survivors than the knowledge that they had saved their ship. In interviews after the war, Franklin veterans consistently expressed pride in what they had accomplished. They had been ordinary sailors thrust into an extraordinary situation, and they had risen to the challenge. They had refused to give up when giving up would have been understandable. They had fought fires and floods and explosions and had won. Many of them said that March 19, 1945 was both the worst and the best day of their lives. The worst because of the horror they witnessed and the friends they lost, but the best because they discovered what they were capable of when everything was on the line. The story of USS Franklin became famous throughout the Navy and the nation. The carrier that wouldn't die, the crew that refused to quit, the 400 who stayed when they could have left. Books were written about Franklin's ordeal. Newspaper articles celebrated the crew's heroism. The ship became a symbol of American resilience, proof that determination and courage could overcome seemingly impossible odds. President Harry Truman mentioned Franklin in a speech about American fighting spirit, calling the crew's actions an inspiration to all Americans. Franklin completed her repairs and returned to service in February 1946 after the war had ended. She served briefly in the post-war Navy, participating in training exercises and serving as a transport. But carriers were being decommissioned rapidly as the Navy contracted to peacetime levels, and Franklin was placed in reserve in February 1947. She never saw combat again. In 1964, USS Franklin was sold for scrap. The ship that had survived the worst damage any carrier endured was cut apart and melted down. But the legacy of USS Franklin endures. Her story is taught at the Naval Academy as an example of damage control excellence. The Navy's damage control schools use Franklin as a case study in how determination and leadership can save a ship, even when the situation seems hopeless. The carrier's actions on March 19, 1945, established standards for damage control that the Navy still follows today. Franklin proved that ships don't die easily if their crews refuse to let them die. The survivors of USS Franklin, those 400 sailors who stayed and fought to save their ship, carried their experience with them for the rest of their lives. They had seen the worst that war could offer. Friends killed, unimaginable destruction, fires and explosions, and chaos. But they had also seen the best of humanity. Courage in the face of death. Sailors risking their lives to save shipmates. Ordinary men doing extraordinary things because it needed to be done. They had been tested in the crucible of combat, and had not been found wanting. In later years, Franklin veterans would hold reunions where they would share memories and honor their fallen shipmates. They would visit the few Franklin artifacts that survived in museums. They would tell their stories to younger generations, trying to convey what it had been like on that burning carrier, what it had meant to keep fighting when everything seemed lost. And they would always emphasize the same point. They weren't heroes. They were just sailors doing their jobs. They had stayed with their ship because that's what sailors do. They had fought to save Franklin because she was their home, and you don't abandon your home without a fight. The Japanese pilot who bombed USS Franklin on March 19, 1945, accomplished a mission that should have sunk one of America's most powerful warships. His two 500-pound bombs caused more damage than most kamikaze attacks, killed more sailors than most torpedo hits, and created conditions that by all logic should have resulted in the carrier's loss. He had done his job perfectly, but he couldn't account for the human factor. He couldn't predict that 400 sailors would refuse to abandon their ship. He couldn't foresee that ordinary men, most with no training in damage control, would fight fires and floods and explosions for hours without giving up. He couldn't imagine that a carrier burning from end to end, listing, exploding, seemingly doomed, would still be afloat a day later. USS Franklin survived March 19, 1945, because her crew made her survive. They fought when fighting seemed hopeless. They persevered when others would have quit. They believed their ship could be saved, and they made that belief reality through sheer determination and courage. The 400 who stayed wrote one of the greatest chapters in naval history, a story of ordinary sailors doing the impossible. And USS Franklin, the carrier that wouldn't die, stands as a permanent testament to what human courage and determination can achieve when everything is on the line. The ship that should have sunk came home instead, brought back from the edge of destruction by sailors who simply refused to give up. That is the legacy of USS Franklin. That is the story of the 400 who stayed. And that is why, more than 75 years later, we still remember Big Ben, the ship that wouldn't die.